Now, as you can expect, right, Socrates does not think much of this argument. Right? And partially you're right to pick up on the sort of flirty relationship between Phaedrus and Socrates. What we're talking about here is a Greek form of love, and it was based on the assumption that a true mutual companionship amongst equals would involve the rational men of that age, right? This was a Greek assumption, so this is Greek love, and it's taken to be a love between an older man and a younger boy, and it's got sort of a tutoring kind of apprenticeship kind of note to it as well, all right? But it's, as we've seen from Lysias's argument, a number of these arguments can apply to our sort of heterosexual relationships if we're into those, and largely he's making a much more general point here. Now, what Socrates, right, Phaedrus is quite impressed by Lysias's argument, and what Socrates wants to claim here, and he does on page 12, is that largely what Lysias did was say what the situation demanded. Right? This was an instrumental argument to pick somebody up, more or less. Right? So, right, Socrates doesn't think much of this argument, and he says on the bottom of page 12 over to 13, I paid attention only to the speech's style. As to the other point, I wouldn't even think that Lysias himself could be satisfied with it, for it seems to me, Phaedrus, unless of course you disagree, that he said the same thing 2 or even 3 times, as if he didn't really have much to say about the subject, almost as if he weren't interested in it. In fact, he seemed to me to be just showing off, trying to demonstrate that he could say the same thing in 2 different ways and say it just as well both times. Right? Now, what Socrates wants to claim here is that he can make a better speech, right, with a bag over his head than the one that Lysias has made and that Phaedrus has just read for him. Right? Now, Socrates, in the character of Socrates, knows his own ignorance, so what he's claiming is that either he's inspired by muses or that he's heard these arguments before, but in the depths of his unwisdom, right, he cannot, right, he cannot be held responsible for what he's saying. Right? So what he's about to do is present, and Phaedrus has to cajole him a little bit here, is present another speech, right, arguing to the same conclusion as the one that Lysias offers here, and it will be a stronger argument for the same conclusion. Right? Now, Phaedrus wants to hold him to some pretty stringent intellectual standards here. Right? Phaedrus, right, wants to have Socrates make a speech, 14, without repeating a word from any of my book. And I promise you that in the name of 9 Ancerons, I shall set up in return a life-size golden statue at Delphi, not only of myself, but also of you. So, more or less, what Phaedrus wants Socrates to do is present a completely new argument, repeating nothing that Lysias has claimed. Right? Now, Socrates points out that he cannot do this. Right? He points out, your real friend, Phaedrus, is good as gold to think I'm claiming Lysias failed in absolutely every respect, and that I can make a speech that is different on every point from his. I'm sure that couldn't happen even to the worst possible author. In our own case, for example, do you think that anyone could argue that one should favor the non-lover rather than the lover without praising the former for keeping his wits about him or condemning the latter for losing his? Points that are essential to make and still have something left to say. So, Phaedrus agrees with Socrates and allows him to import this one sort of line of argument into his argument. So Socrates' speech is going to involve this idea that love makes you lose your wits, right? Or that love, here, excuse me, love is a form of madness. Now, the major difference in these arguments that are about to be made here, right, is that the form of argument that Socrates is about to employ, well, it does a few things, right? In reading Lysias' speech, right, one of the main problems with Lysias' speech that Socrates is about to address is that he did not define the term love, nor did he define the term non-love. Right? That's one of the major problems that Socrates is about to address. Right? The other major problem that Socrates is about to address is the relatively weak argument form that Lysias was using. Right? It's an inductive argument, and it can only show, right, and the smattering of terms throughout this argument, saying what is likely, what seems to be the case, blah, 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 etc., right, indicate that this is sort of a weak argument. Right? If we're going to base our decisions rationally, as Socrates and eventually Plato want to claim, right, what we need is stronger support for the argument, and we have to get clear on the terms love and non-love. If we define those terms, this is something philosophers like to do, if we define those terms, right, then we've got a much clearer, more precise idea of what we are talking about. Right? So what Socrates is about to do is provide an argument in the form of a deductive argument, right, in favor of this idea of love being a form of madness or craziness. Right? And he's going to do this by defining the term love. Right? Now, in addition to this, right, I usually like to provide these two arguments on a Friday, send people home for a weekend, and then come back on the Monday, ask how their weekend was, and show that neither Lysias or Socrates' arguments really stand. Right? They're problematic. Right? So what Socrates does, and this is your cue, in terms of a literary device, to understand that this is not going to be Socrates' final position, but what Socrates is going to do is pull a bag over his head. He's going to provide an argument in favor of this non-love relationship, right, with his hood pulled over his head, so that because he's embarrassed of what he's about to argue. Now, recall from the Apology, or other Platonic or Socratic dialogues that you've read, Socrates had this little voice that chirps up in the back of his head. Right? If you look at a series of Magnum PI quotes, you'll find that Magnum had this little voice that said that chirped up whenever things didn't quite add up. It helped him solve crimes, right? Etc., etc. Now, what Socrates wants to point out is that the entire time he's making this argument in favor of non-love, this little voice in the back of his head is shouting at him, Socrates, Socrates, wait, no, don't argue that. That's not true. That's not what you believe. The argument doesn't stand. It's problematic. Right? Now, if we all had such a little voice in the back of our head, right, that would be extremely helpful in terms of making sound arguments. Right? But most of us don't. Socrates is sort of a weird case, right, that far. So the argument we're about to see from Socrates is not really what Socrates wants to argue, right? And largely what Socrates is doing in sort of a strange way is strengthening, right, the argument from Lysias so that the argument that he's refuting will be a stronger argument, right? There are a lot of argumentation theorists that wind up arguing that this is part of our dialectical obligation. If you make a bad argument that's easy for me to refute, right, I can just knock it down quite easily. Right? And right, that seems to offer support to my position since I've knocked down your position. Right? Socrates doesn't want to make that sort of argument because he's not only interested in winning the day, he's interested in getting at what's truest or best. Right? So what he has to do when criticizing an argument is make it as strong as possible.